And so just if you don't know him, Oliver is probably the biggest, or at least one of the biggest names in dual coding in education. So he writes and he draws a lot about that, and it's all very, very interesting and very useful and practical advice as well. So not only the theory, but also actual good things that you can do in your classroom. He has worked as a head teacher at training schools in college, and he has written several books about that topic and about just visual teaching, right? Using visual stimuli to teaching. You can follow him on Twitter at OliCav, and you can follow us at Seneca Learn. So please do tweet about this presentation so we can both get back to you. So if I don't answer, or he doesn't answer one of your questions, if I don't ask one of your questions, go for Twitter and just make sure that you share this presentation as much as you can, because that will help all the teachers as well. So I'm just gonna write down the chat again, our Twitter handles. There you go. Also, I want to remind everybody that Oliver has very kindly written a free CPD course for Seneca Learning. So if you go on our website, you can take a whole course written by Oliver about dual coding. And then after that, you can go and buy his book, which is a very good book. Okay, so I think we can start now. Oliver, please. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, is that my screen? Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, fine. So hello everyone. This is not the normal course I do, it's the next one up, so it's more advanced. So let me tell you what I aim to achieve in it. I don't know whether that makes any sense to you, but I can promise you, and I'm not going to meet you yet, that actually by the end of this, by half an hour, that will make total sense to you. So let me take you through. There are 3 sections in our 25 minutes. I'm going to introduce something called image schemas, which are really, really interesting. I've become totally obsessed by them. And then we're going to look at graphic organizers. And at the end, we're going to have a test. Okay, so here's what I want to say about image schemas. Again, I don't know what this makes any sense to you. And at the risk of making you more confused, image schemas are neither images nor are they schemas. They're like infinite logic we learn about the world. So for example, let me just introduce you to, here's Chloe. Chloe has she has many emotional states. In one she's sad, in one the other she's happy. Now I've depicted them to you on a horizontal scale. If I were to put one above the other, which would go above the other? When you normally think of these emotions, does sad go above happy or does happy go above sad? I don't know what your answer is. Well, actually, I do know, I'm guessing, and you'll all be saying this. And I want to ask you, how do you know? Who taught you that? Who sat you down? Did your parents sit you down and say, listen, here are the facts about life. Some things are higher than others. So let me give you another one. Not about emotion, about morality. A priest and a robber. And if we were going to put them on a vertical scale, then you learned this before you were 3. You learned that one is higher order than the other. How did you know? When you play the news tonight, when you listen to the news, you won't at all be thrown when you hear that the Dow Jones is up. Actually, the Dow Jones is down. When the Dow Jones is down and you're an investor, you're sad. We talk about higher ranking. We, for some reason, believe head teachers are higher ranking than teaching assistants. We have a vertical scale. And we apply that vertical scale so many times. Where did you learn that? You learned it when, as a youngster, you poured water into a cup or any other receptacle, and you noticed this phenomenon about the world, that the more water or liquid you poured into the cup, the higher it was. And so more is up. And more is up is one of the many image schemas that are early infant logic that are so entrenched in you, you don't even aware that you've got them. And yet they're the basis for most of our abstract thinking. So I'm going to introduce you now. I'm going to continue with this theme for a while. Barbara Tversky spent 4 decades looking at cognition and visuals, and this is one of her conclusions. Wonderful book last year, really readable, fabulous, fabulous book. I don't know whether this makes any sense to you. The mind, and that includes your mind, because this is what happens unconsciously. We regard ideas as objects. I'll come back to that. So here's the next activity. Chloe's a teacher, and she's going to say something. And I used to be a head teacher of a school for children with learning difficulties in a special school. I want you to read what she's saying to her pupils, and I want you to consider whether I, or indeed you, could teach this to children in a special school. Here goes. Here goes. I mean, it's really complex. I mean, I did A-level English. It sounds like the sort of thing I would come across there. Shakespeare's considered central to the canon, you know, and all the rest of it. I'm going to show you what's entailed in this concept. And we're going to explain it in terms of some of the logic we learned before we were 3. It's like this. There's a container. And we were used to containers. We used to containers when youngsters, we put things in containers, out of containers. We spend hours and hours and days learning all about containers, about objects in containers. So we have a container, it's either in or it's out. We also learn another logic. It came up in that word. We use the word central, at the heart, the hub. So we know that central is more important than peripheral. So that dot represents Shakespeare. So this container represents the canon of English literature. So André Gide is a writer I like who's French. He's a brilliant writer, but he's not allowed in there because he's French, he's not English. So this is, my neighbour's an English person, but he doesn't write very well, so he can't go in there. So that's Shakespeare in the centre. And there on the edge, a peripheral figure, a marginal figure on the very edge is Joe Orton. Some people think he deserves to be outside of it. So at this stage, there are a couple of things I want you to bring together. Maybe some of the things we teach, the actual concepts, aren't half as difficult as the language with which we use. But once we understand the type of language we're using to make sense, the word central, the word peripheral, on the edge, then we can see that essentially what we're doing when we speak, we're using these logics that we learned about the world when we were 1 and 2. And we're using metaphors. Let me show you what comes next. Here's a cognitive linguist and a philosopher, and they wrote a book showing how most of our language is metaphorical. But when I say metaphorical, I don't mean it in the elaborate English literature, you know, rhetorical flourishes. When we say something is central, when we say something is in or out, that is a metaphor, because it's not literal. So can you see that completely and accurately describes what it was Chloe, the teacher, was doing conceptually, unaware, because they're so entrenched. She was having a container, she was saying what's in the middle of it and all the rest of it, as I showed you, totally unaware of what they were doing. But once you can catch yourself out with the sort of language that you use, we can see how we can also represent those metaphors spatially. And in the example I showed you, perhaps it reveals how simple our concepts are. There are many, many metaphors we use, but the main two we use for thinking as the container model that we've just been used to seeing, in which here are just some of the words we use. They're just some of the words. And if I were to have a complete and comprehensive list of all the words to do with containers, I'm going to suggest you couldn't do your job. And the other one is a path model. So children very early on realize that they're somewhere in space, and where they want to get to, the goal is somewhere away from them, and it needs force to get from there to over there. So we have technically it's called source, path, goal, but I've shortened it to path model. And we can be anywhere on there. I want to tell you there'd be no educational or management assessment or appraisal without this model. Management appraisal and educational assessment is based on nothing more complex fundamentally than something we learned as 2-year-olds. I'm here, I want to get there. And then you get all the concomitant language that goes with it. All of it. So, this may disappoint you because he may be a hero of yours, but I want to tell you that Captain Kirk was completely and utterly wrong. Space is our first frontier. We explore us as an object with all the objects in the world, and we notice we have containers, and to achieve a goal, we have to exert force to take ourselves or an object towards that goal. Space. That's why it's so primary. It's the main metaphor with which we are able to express our thinking. So, question number 2, graphic organizers, section number 2. So, let's start. Friedrich Rieff, in his book, Applying Cognitive Science to Education, came up with an interesting hierarchy of organizational structures. The first is nothing, just talking. The next, you just randomly put words on a board, and it's really better than nothing. This is the hierarchy, by the way. So the next lowest is a list. I don't have much time to explore it, but I could spend a whole hour talking about it. I welcome and value knowledge organizers, but they're miscalled, they're mistitled, because they actually don't do much organizing. They're just a bunch of lists. Lists are useful, but they don't organize. They're nowhere near a schema. Next higher is a network. And Rieff says that can be really descriptive and accurate of the relationships in something you're discussing. And yet, because each thing you're discussing is idiosyncratic, unique, it takes a lot of effort to remember it off by heart. So the most efficient for memory he's found in his studies is a simple hierarchy. We go all the way back to Plato, Aristotle, hierarchies, superordinate, subordinate, consumption, the whole thing. Because once you understand how a hierarchy is constructed, and by the way, nearly everything, all our knowledge can be contained within hierarchies. Everything on a website, all the contents in books, they're all hierarchical subcomponents. Once you know how that's built up, and it can be built up top-down deductively or bottom-up inductively, once you know that, you need only remember the top, and everything else comes free. It's already nested in it. It's sticky, it's nested knowledge. So let's see what these two gentlemen say again. They just remind us that space is where it's at. So earlier on, at the beginning of this section, I talked about what researchers found is the biggest mistake teachers make is they choose the wrong visual. And in the domain of graphic organizers, they choose the wrong graphic organizer because insufficient work has been done in categorizing. So I used to get teachers come to my courses and say, Oliver, and then they talk about a graphic organizer like it's their favorite tool. And I was struggling to find a polite way to say that that's really not a useful way to think about it. And I kind of came out with this story. I'm going to tell you about a chisel. I want you to imagine me as a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old. I'm going on a building site for the first time. I'm a bit embarrassed because my mother's ironed my jeans, so I look a bit inappropriately smart. And I've got a big kit bag, and in it, I dive in there because there's only one thing in there. And gormlessly, I say to the foreman, I like chisels. It's obviously stupid. I mean, it's unbelievably stupid because my whatever I like in the tools has got nothing to do that's appropriate to the selection of the tool, that's appropriate to the content. So I'll look at the content, the material, and the task that's needed. So I may use a screw, I may use a saw. So the choice of tool depends on the content. This is the principle with which we're going to decide what graphic organizer we need. So we can split graphic organizers up into two types. There's the container model and there's the path model. Within the container model, oh, by the way, did you see that? Let me go back to show you. Let me do that again. Maybe we should move the word graphic organizer and distinguish a knowledge organizer by calling these graphic organizers knowledge schemas, because they are schematic, they're interrelated. Well, you'll see what they are. So Reef was wrong in a way, because he was arguing as if there's only one sort of final graphic organizer. He's a bit like, I'm being really rude of me saying I like chisels. It's just those. So you'll see what I mean later on. There are many more, but here are just 3 graphic organizers or knowledge schema that relates to defining, describing, chunking. We look at the whole and the part and their relationships. Psychologists talk about the whole part relationships. And we're dealing with one thing. When we deal with more than one thing and we want to compare their relative attributes, then we look at comparison. And you'll recognize a Venn diagram. And these two, and there are many, many more graphic organizers that could be categorized in there. I've just shown you 3 to give you a sense. They do the job of defining and comparing. And they're both container models. A path model, which is movement, process, going to a goal. We have a sequence, and you all know these. And then we have cause and effect. And pretty much for 15, 20 years, I've been in schools and colleges up and down the country, and I ask staff, I want you to catch me out, I want you to embarrass me, I want you to find something in your curriculum with which these tools could not adequately and indeed very satisfactorily capture. I mean, maybe a couple of the tools, it may be hybrids, but these would capture all the schematic structures that are underneath your narratives of your subject. And if we had more time, we'd have fun trying to catch me out. So now comes the test time. Are you ready? So this is bye-bye to I like chisels. Now it comes, what's the content? What do you want me to do? Now let me choose the tool. So I have 4 questions for you, and I'm going to model the first one. Each question has a 3-part answer. First thing, I want you to put slow motion on your mind, and I want you to read the question, and I want you to tell me, well, you tell yourself, declare to yourself, which are the key trigger words? Which words illuminate the type of question, the type of thinking that's required? Let me show you. What exactly is the current coronavirus? To me, the word what and the word is. Immediately shout out defining. So I'm going to say that's the key word. It's relating to container, and it requires that I choose a graphic organizer from the chunk or define series. I mean, if we had more time, we would then see which of those 3 or more might be the most appropriate. But for the moment, it's really important that you go for a 3-part answer. Which are the trigger words? And it's really hard for teachers to do this because it's so obvious to them. So I talk about putting slow motion on your mind, read it. Which words shout out? This is this type of thinking that's required. Then tell me whether it's container or path, and then tell me within those 2, whether it's chunk or compare if it's container, or sequence or cause and effect for path model. So I'm going to be quiet now for 3 minutes, maybe less. And I want you to write down, if you would, your 3-part answer to those 3. So there'll be 9 sections. Keyword, trigger word, container or path, which type of graphic organizer?
We can be here for a few more than 3 minutes, that's all right.
Sorry, about 3 minutes?
Yeah, we can wait more than 3 minutes. That's
Yeah,
okay
yeah.
for people to give their answers. A lot of people saying path and sequence.
They can't hear what you're saying, yeah?
They know. They can hear what they, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just reading out loud what they're saying on the chat.
I'll give it another full minute and then I'll go into what that's like. Half a minute, a bit less than half a minute. 3 answers. Trigger word, which model, container or path, which type of graphic organizer. Don't forget, this is what researchers said is the single biggest mistake they've found over decades of looking at the use of visuals in classrooms. Okay, how did the previous SARS virus play out? The words that come out to me is not the word how, is play out. Play out to me. So that's a path. So play out is from here to there. In novel, it's a path, it's a process. So I'd look at the sequence. So I've got the word how. It doesn't actually ask me why. Now, next one. So that was play out, path, sequence. Basically, what happened? Next one. In what ways is the current coronavirus and SARS similar? The key word to me is similar. If you have the word similar, we have to be looking at more than one thing. So we're going container, and then we're comparing. Because you've got coronavirus on one hand, SARS on the other, and we're asking to what degree they're similar. And in the process of identifying in what ways they're similar, you will by definition also be identifying in which ways they are not similar, they are dissimilar. So you're comparing. And obviously, I mean, you've got the last one, I'll go through it, but I'll let you know what words to me. What impact did the SARS virus have on the global economy? There are 2 words. The first one is impact. Path model is source, path, goal, and the only way objects in the world can get from the source to the path is through force. So I'd have the word impact and also the word on. Impact on, and I'd look at cause and effect. Just got a couple of minutes. I just want to show you a slide that I had reduced to. I'm going to reveal it now because I want to reassure you, this isn't just Oliver making stuff up. You have good reason to believe just Oliver making stuff up. So down at the bottom are the 4 categories I came up with. And at the top, I'm going to show you other people around the world who've come up with the same conclusion. So it's no surprise. The first is a really a 30-year-old book from American for children with special needs. And they didn't use the word container or path because that research hadn't yet come out. But prior to that, they'd had their own word. They categorized graphic organizers, or they call semantic organizers to do with meaning, as stasis. You can see that means the same thing as container, just stuff, content, or change, which is dynamic and path. So they had the same idea. So let me now list you a number of them. Here's a book I picked up in a library decades ago, Think and Link. And look, they have classification, I have chunk. They have comparison and contrast, I have compare. Sequencing, cause and effect. Our own Ruth Walker, brilliant science teacher and blog writer, she looked at the structure of scientific knowledge. She came up with the same 4. She didn't know about mine. Mark Sarno, probably the greatest researcher we ought to be reading. His book was should have been a bestseller in the UK, and it wasn't. Far superior to Hattie's. Different kinds of words. I'm sure he had something of a comparison. I couldn't find it in there. It must have been hidden within something else. David Hiley, working for decades in America on graphic organizers, he calls them visual tools. We have the same thing, classifying, whole part, comparing, sequencing. Ted Ragg, you're probably too young to know Ted Ragg. He was he was teacher's favourite professor, used to write in the TES, and his book on explaining was really fabulous. And he too, I couldn't find anything directly on comparison. My guess, if I look further, I'd find it within concepts. Because in a way, you can only define something by comparing it with something else. So comparing is almost intrinsic within defining. And Bernie Mohan, those linguists amongst you will know his research for decades on how to teach a language as a second language as pretty much the same thing. So different words, pretty much really rigorous agreement over the decades and different disciplines about these four. I wanted to reassure you, it wasn't just some kind of wacky idea I had. So I'm leaving you now with this statement we started off with. Returning to under 3-year-old discoveries about the world and objects in space, we developed these things called image schemas, which are so entrenched, we have no awareness of them. Cognitive linguists, neuroscientists, and philosophers, all their disciplines have come together, and they've looked at how our language and therefore our thinking is predominantly spatial, metaphoric, and the spatial metaphors are the ones that predominate, that dominate and shape how we conceive of and express and communicate ideas. By making this overt and explicit, and seeing how our language can tally up with these different types of graphic organizers, we can organize objects, that's to say words, spatially in a non-linear fashion, and we can access the structure of concepts more easily to more children, not as a fight against words, as a basis in which we can improve children's understanding and therefore improve their linguistic behaviors. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. That was very good. Hi. Thank you very much, Oliver. I'm sure everybody appreciated that a lot and already learned a lot.
Shall I
there
stop
are
sharing
questions.
my screen?
Yeah, you can stop that now, I think. You can always go back if you want to share a slide again or talk a bit more things. So questions keep coming. I got a few when you were presenting.
Yeah.
So actually that's one of my, so I'll start with my own questions. I noticed that you always stop when you change the slide before you start talking about that slide. Is that on purpose? Is there anything to do with cognitive load?
The research tells us that when we read, we sub-vocalize, even though we thought we grew out of it when we were about 4 or 5. Yeah. And so when you read, you're filling up your auditory channel. And then if I read as well, you've got 2 auditory inputs. Yeah. Now, I've had some recent interesting discussions with some psychologists on Twitter, and actually I've done it because I didn't want to be bored with people saying, Oliver, don't you know you shouldn't read your slides out? And actually, when we're talking about adults, and when we're talking about slides that don't have a lot of text, personally, I never felt overloaded by someone reading a slide. You know, I don't start crying. I don't start tearing my little bits of hair out. It's really not that much of a big deal. Yeah. But I do it because I think people will be distracted. Instead of listening to what I'm saying, they go, oh, I've got one over on him. Doesn't he know that dual coding says, you know, and all that kind of stuff. So some of these discoveries we learn in the laboratory are true in the laboratory, but they may be insignificant in real life. You know, they don't have the significance outside in real life. And I'm going to suggest that may be a case. Though with children, given that they are novices and they're nearly always encountering unfamiliar material, it's a good practice to have. I've noticed by doing it with adults online, it actually gives everyone, particularly me, I'm too fast. It just makes me slow down. Right. And then I'll often tell someone, I didn't do it today, but you know that quote, ideas are objects. I'll sometimes say, there's going to be a quote coming up and you may think it's meaningless, kind of a bit nutty, but hold on, notice your reactions and take it on board. So I'm able to coach the way they listen first, which I find is really quite useful, which wasn't the intended purpose of not reading out slides, but I think it's a more powerful thing. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that was my question. Now there are questions from everybody else. So there was a question from Sarah. It's actually more a comment, but I thought it was interesting, so we wanted to hear your opinion about that. She said,
Some things are different according to language. So in English, we talk about time in terms of length, like a long time. But then in Swedish, I guess that's where she's from, they talk about the amount of time or the volume of time, and that affects perception of time. So
yeah, I had that earlier on in Twitter and saying, someone said, you could tell me, are you Spanish or Portuguese?
Portuguese.
Oh, well, in Spanish, it's volume.
Yeah.
It's volume. It's a cultural thing. So these image schemas that children, toddlers develop, they are pre-linguistic. They're pre-linguistic.
Mm-hmm.
So you get it as a gestalt.
Right.
That's to say, a complete, meaningful experience that involves everything and all our senses. You get it. It makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
You don't reflect on it. You don't communicate about it. It's just absorbed as just, that's just what reality is.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we develop language, and we don't choose our language, you know, we're born into our cultural language, we pick up whatever formats, whichever metaphors that culture has adopted and promoted. But whether you say time is distance or it's volume, it's the same stuff. We're talking about physical objects and space to represent abstract ideas. George Lakoff recently, Efrat Fruist pointed me to a video of him in which he starts off saying, listen, ideas don't float about in space. They're not in the air. Ideas are not in the air. And that may be a problem. We use the word abstract thinking. All the abstract thoughts we have, they're not abstract.
Right.
You know, they come from jelly in your head. Everything is embodied. Everything is physical. And we can't talk about hardly any abstract ideas other than through our physical embodied experience. And unknowingly, we then adopt the metaphor, the linguistic metaphors, which our culture has, and we're unaware it comes from our toddler's experience.
Good. There are a lot of technical questions on what's the best software to help create graphic organizers or to create presentations.
All right, very quickly then. I don't use it anymore. There's American software, which I thought was really quite good, called Inspiration. It's been around 20 years. That's a long time for a bit of software. And you can create lots of different types of organizers. Unfortunately, they ought to pay me. They should categorize their graphic organizers into the 4 types. So I think the worst thing is teachers just then look at loads of graphic organizers, and then they'll try everything. Oh, I like that one, I like that one, I like that one. Even if you get good at it, you're limiting your understanding because you're not dealing with the subject knowledge and then the structure of that knowledge. So you helicopter, you have a metacognitive view of the structure, and then you choose a type of graphic organizer. But that's quite useful. But now I've taught you, you can never forget. You can never forget container part. Oh, is it, you know, you can go through those 4. Otherwise, the most incredible breakthrough I've seen over the last 6 months has been teachers using PowerPoint. So Microsoft PowerPoint for decades has been copying and catching up Apple Keynote. And now it's done such a great job. Even I would use it. You know, it's great. And here's the secret. There's guides. You can bring on guides so you can have a grid. Yep. Every piece of professional graphic work is built on top of a grid, which is invisible once it's printed. So you get that grid, and then you can do pretty much every graphic organizer you want to.
Okay.
But what I would recommend is don't start on a computer. Do the same exercise we just had as the test. What do you want? What question are you going to ask the students? And what explanatory device are you going to use when you explain? And is that container or path? And which of the 4 graphic organizers? Get that really clear. I'd even work on paper. Do it on paper first. And probably the best bet is to use Post-it notes, tiny ones, big fat felt tip. Don't go writing paragraphs, keywords, and then move the Post-its around on a big sheet of paper, or preferably stand up and use the wall, like I do.
Okay.
Then you'll get to see, first of all, the bits of paper and their arrangement will be as if they reflect your thinking. Then pretty soon you'll realize, actually, as I'm moving it around, I realize that wall is a projection of my mind. It's an extension of my mind. That is my mind.
Yep.
So the moving is the thinking. It's not just representing the thinking, it is the thinking. Then once you've done the thinking, then go onto the screen. Generally, I find screens stop us thinking.
Right.
We get into, shall I use that line? What color do I like? And all that kind of nonsense. It's the thinking that matters. Do it on post-it notes on paper, tiny post-its, little tiny post-it notes, move them around.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good advice. It's more about how you are organizing your thoughts than the actual software that you are using. Yeah.
Organizing is everything. I just want to say something. It's not a question, but organizing is the most misunderstood, least acknowledged aspect of learning. There's pretty much no learning going on without organizing, because organizing is meaning making. Meaning making is schema development. We love the word schema. It looks really highfalutin and really order, and organizing sounds like something your cleaner does, you know. But actually it's not. Organizing is so elevated.
Yeah.
Organizing is schema formation. It's the same thing.
What about students? There are some questions. There was one from Gemma asking, would you recommend teaching students how to identify which organizer they should use, or how they should work with dual coding when they are making their notes and studying?
I tell you, I could, and if I could, you could, every one of you could. I could teach this to your students in one lesson. And we can pick up a comic book, we could pick up a newspaper, we could pick up a textbook, and they'll go, container. And then we go, is it one thing? Yeah. Chunk, is it more than two things? Compare. They'll get to it really, really easily. And so there are some primary schools now where teachers, before they introduce new material, they say something like, right, we're going to look at this, and this is the angle I'm going to take as I first explain it. So first of all, we're going to look at it as a container, and we're going to define it, chunk it, and then I'm going to bring in what we learned earlier on, and we're going to compare the two. And then when we've done that, we're going to work out what happened. So we're on the path now, and they'll pick it up naturally. It won't take you any more time. It's like, to me, it's a direct way of making children more intelligent, because they have some tools with which to start grappling with knowledge rather than just receiving stuff. They'll know this is the human mechanism. You know, we talk a lot about metacognition. To me, this is probably the greatest metacognitive tool there is. It's the interaction between a human and knowledge. Of course, it's humans that create knowledge. So we're passing on our cultural legacy, how other humans have shaped and defined certain content in different knowledge structures. So it's a real cultural thing.
Yeah. In terms of subjects, not sure why, but interesting, there are a lot of MFL teachers here today, and they are asking if you have any advice when you're teaching languages, when you're using dual coding and these organizers.
I taught French 40 years ago, so
okay.
That's a long time ago. Generally, there are two subjects for which graphic organizers are really quite specific. Maths. There's one particular tool which is appropriate to maths, which captures mathematical processes. We won't talk about that now. Modern foreign language, for the most part, I'd see there's no real need to use graphic organizers. So dual coding has two stories. This is story number 2, dealing with concepts using diagrams. Story number 1, which is really what Pivio experimented with for 4 decades, is really, really simple stuff. So it's not conceptual. So I'm going to learn German or French. I've got a picture of a cat and I have the word chat.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's really simple stuff. You know, you don't have to explain to me what a cat is. I just know what a cat is. But to learn a new language, you put it together so it gets encoded doubly. So that's why it's called dual coding. So you have double the chance of retrieving it. It's useful, but it's really, really not that significant in schools, because there's not much work we do where we just like, here's some really boring stuff, just learn stuff off. Now, the thing with language is, there's not much language going on unless you know a lot of vocabulary. So in that sense, dual coding story number 1, and there's a number of bits of research to show that it does help in vocabulary learning. Double coded coming in, double the chance of it coming out.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess people were jealous that we were talking about languages and they started asking about maths.
Okay, there's a very specific graphic organizer, which is a hybrid. By the way, whatever graphic organizer you can have, don't feel trammeled by it. You can create graphic organizers as long as you know what the 4 types of thinking is. So I've created one which is a mixture of a sequence and cause and effect.
Yeah.
It's a bit like a container and a container within a flowchart. Let me tell you why. It gets really interesting when you look at research because some of it doesn't tally. So I spent most of my life in a special school, and we know some children get overwhelmed with information. And if you give them a 3-part instruction, they find they can't take it in. So then what you do is what's behavior is called task analysis, salami slicing. So you teach me, Flavia, and I can't get your 3-part explanation. So you give me a 12-part.
Okay.
So 12 parts what I need. But of course, being someone who needs something broken up probably means that my working memory is quite reduced anyway. So although I need 12 sections, when you give me 12 sections, I go, oh, too many. So when you look at research closely, many of them just come up against each other.
Yeah.
So I need things task analyzed into smaller parts, and I'm the very person who can't handle it. So, and that really happens with maths. So what you do is you get these 12 steps and you group them into a stage. Stage 1 has 4 steps together. So that's a container. Then the next stage has 4 steps. That's container. The third stage has 4 steps. That's a container. So you've got 3 stages. I can handle that. You don't forget Nelson, Cowan. We're 4 plus or minus 1 for our working memory. So I can handle 3 stages. And when I get to the first one, that container has 4 steps. I can handle 4. So it's when we get it, I think it's a call for psychologists to let us know these bits of research that really don't tally up together. And so a teacher goes, he needs it broken down, but wow, it overwhelms him. What should I do? So that's when you can go into graphic organizers and you can create some hybrids that suit you.
Yep.
But you won't do that on screen. Do it on paper.
Okay. I'm not going to be asking about every subject people are asking. If you want to hear specific advice about your own subject, maybe you can tweet Oliver and us. And just so I'm going to ask the more like higher level questions, and then we can go back to the subject specific ones if we have time in the end. There are questions about students answering long answer questions or essays. Do you think when they study and they learn with those organizers, will they help them to analyze a question and explain their own words? A longer essay question.
I would need to have a conversation with a subject teacher. So I'm in no position to say. My sense is these 4 structures can help them, give them a start.
Yeah.
Then there'll be some subject specific stuff you'll need them to get out of the question. And it's not the position for me to say it. I could do it. I mean, when I do some consultation, I did some in a school in York in which we looked at history. So when I have people there and together they tell me what their perennial everyday problems as they encounter novices meeting complex and unfamiliar concepts, then we'll untangle it and we'll work out solutions. Because the problems of teacher explanation are bound up with the metaphors they use. And until they understand their explanations are almost wholly dependent on the metaphors, unless they get to see what these image schemas are, it's hard to untangle them. Okay,
so continuing from the metaphors, there was a question from Laura. She asked, they're using a lot of metaphors in their school, she's saying, but they also have a lot of non-native speakers, or if you think about the gap, the writing gap, the reading gap, you think metaphors will work for everybody? Should we keep anything in mind? Taking into account that kids have different language
I don't
skills.
think you have a chance. I think this is what a teacher would look like if they didn't use metaphors.
Okay.
You wouldn't say anything.
Yeah.
I want to invite you to reflect on your language. Every time you use a preposition, let me just show you a slide.
Yeah.
Show you a slide. Let me just show you a slide. Okay. I need to share my screen. So I'm going to share my screen. Share screen. And when I find this, I was I was giving a presentation at Teach First conference, and at the beginning I had to listen to someone talk. And in a 7-minute period, though to be honest, it's only 5-minute period, this is what came out. Reuben Moore's great, lovely speech. This is what came out of his mouth. This was me. None of these phrases or words are literal.
Mm.
None of them are literal. You know, I've only just started opening your eyes to the idea that we speak in metaphors. When you look at it in detail, if you have a bit of a linguistic analysis of every word you write and you speak, almost all of it is metaphors. It's metaphoric in nature. So you don't have an option. No, I don't think I'll use a metaphor with my children.
Mm-hmm.
You use them all the time. When you use the word on, for the most part, every preposition is a metaphor. This was just 5 to 7 minutes.
Yep.
One person.
Yeah, I guess we don't think about that very much.
Just continual. So Bernie, who I did show you, didn't I? Bernie Mohan. He teaches English as a language as a second language, and he finds that his use of graphic organizers helps get the concept across. Once you get the concept across, so they get the concept, they start from a platform of understanding and meaning, which they can then start dealing with the linguistic mechanisms of that second language. If you're dealing only with the language and you haven't got the concept or the meaning, I'd find it impossible. Because human beings are meaning makers. Let them get the meaning first. Mm-hmm. Then they can understand why we've chosen, all right, this culture uses that way of expressing it. It makes sense. Mm-hmm. Whereas the phrases don't make any sense until you've got the meaning.
That's true. Yeah, I guess we don't realize how much of that we say. Yeah. There were a few people asking about Rosenshine. So how does dual coding fit into the Rosenshine's principles?
Okay, I haven't got Rosenshine next to me, so you can see how porous my memory is. Explanation has something to do with Rosenshine. So do you remember that Chloe was giving a talk? Children like to consider the proposition that Shakespeare is central to the canon of English literature, whereas that somewhat irascible 60s playwright Joe Orton is a mere marginal figure on the periphery. What would that mean? Mm. So that's great language. So I'm not against using rich language, but if you have the meaning first, you get the concept, then you can then develop the diagram, the graphic organizer, bit by bit, in collaboration, in coordination with your speaking. They'll get it. It'll reinforce the richness and the concepts, linguistic concepts, by having the diagram. Also, Rosenshine talks about small steps. Mm-hmm. Graphic organizer is the perfect way to do it. We talked about it with maths. And of course, as Tom Sherrington observes, probably the single greatest omission in teachers' repertoire, although they all claim they do it, so who am I to say, is check for understanding. And once you've taught children how to construct certain graphic organizers, it's a wonderful way to check their understanding. Because it's closer in format to a schema than written text. And so a graphic organizer so Flavia and I, if you, me and somebody else were together as a group, a graphic organizer would hold our attention and we would have something to talk about. And so, you know, that Chomsky language acquisition device, we'd have all the natural grammar because we're starting from meaning. So we've got a human urge to communicate to another human, and it'll all get bound up in grammar, and we would explain it. And of course, you know that thing that you can't write that which you can't talk about, that becomes a perfect rehearsal for your writing. And we could go on, but that kind of gives you a flavor of Rosenshine.
Yeah, very good. There was a question about timelines, especially if you're teaching history.
Yes.
Those are type of graphic organizers.
Indeed.
They are. So the question was, they tell you the sequence of events, but they don't really explain how long, like the duration of each, relative duration, that's what they meant. Do you have any tips on how to improve timeline?
Well, first of all, let's get a bit cognitive. Cognitive scientists tell us we have no mental apparatus with which to detect or perceive time. None whatsoever. what human beings do is they can perceive an event, and then they perceive another event, then they perceive another event, and from that they infer this thing called time. And because that's so airy-fairy, we then say, let's pretend it's a thing.
Okay.
And let's pretend it's a line.
Mm-hmm.
And let's pretend it goes from behind us to in front of us. Nearly every culture in the world does that. There are some remarkable where they go the other way round. So that's all make-believe, that's all metaphor. And historians, I told earlier on, that mathematical graphic organizer called a flow spray, it's a mixture between a spray and a flow chart.
Mm-hmm. Historians
have always done that because they talk about this period, that period. So historians don't go, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. They don't do that. They say, let's chunk these years together. We call that an episode, an era, a phase, or whatever. So they're used to doing that. And as to causality,
Mm-hmm.
of all the graphic organizers, the one which is most problematic, is most difficult, it's more advanced, is cause and effect. Cause and effect. So I don't know, but I imagine that a great deal of history and science is about making a distinction between what is merely temporal connection, called and then sequence, and what is a causal connection. Now, Jeff Petty, who wrote a book, the first book on evidence-based teaching in England 20 years ago, of my 4 distinctions, he said, Oliver, I like that, but I tell you, distinguishing sequence and cause and effect is too complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what I've always got up my sleeve is my special school experience. And that book I mentioned, Pearson and Denner, in it, they make a distinction that they've worked with children in special schools. So I want you to consider this. In fact, you may want to draw it. The top of a sheet of paper, draw a circle with the word B in it.
Mm-hmm.
And below, draw a circle with the word L in it. And we can join it either with a skinny or a fat arrow. A skinny arrow represents temporal relations. That's to say sequence. That's to say and then. A fat arrow represents causal relations. That's to say consequently. So B and L.
Mm-hmm.
Skinny or fat arrow. Or let me tell you what the words mean. B means breakfast, L means lunch. You can go top to bottom or left to right, doesn't matter.
Right.
So clearly it's a temporal relation. Breakfast does not cause lunch.
No.
So somewhere in there is creating a distinction between a temporal relation and a causal relation. And as you go into it, they become ever more subtle distinctions. So some of the distinctions you use with children entering the first stages of historical thinking, it's a bit crude. Something is merely temporal, something's merely causal. But I guess that's the bread and butter of historical thinking.
Right. That was very interesting, yeah. What about metacognition? Do you think when students work with graphic organizers, do they help them think about their own learning?
There are decades of research showing the benefits of graphic organizers for metacognition. Here's how I see it. I personally, I neither have the brain power or the attention or the assiduous nature to reflect on my thinking and look at what my thinking is. Maybe I'm just too damn lazy. But when I extract my thinking and I project it into a graphic organizer, then all of a sudden there's no memorizing, there's no this abstract reflection. I'm looking at objects and I'm saying to myself, that doesn't go there, that's a bit more here, that goes after that. I'm really, really practical. There's really abstract thing called metacognition. But I've been reading about metacognition for 40 years, and it's always there, like the carrot. It's going to be our solution, and it never gets any closer. It's so abstract. Graphic organizers just makes that abstract internal thinking public, concrete, shareable, discussable, manipulable, changeable. Just makes it a really everyday phenomenon.
Yep. We're actually out of time. There's one more question that I'm going to ask, and I want to say I did not have time to read all the questions. Sorry if I didn't read your question. Please make sure you tweet Oliver and us, and then when he has time, he'll try to get back to you. Can I say that? Yeah. Okay, and we can get back to you as well. So the question was, if I can find it, I just closed it. Oh yeah, about hierarchies. So you showed some hierarchies, and the question was, do they always look like that? because the organizers can go in different shapes. It's always a hierarchy, like 1
Have I
and
got
then
time to
2
show you
and then
something?
3. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to show you. Am I really going to do it? Ah, okay. No, I'm not. Let me try one more time.
Yeah.
No, one more time. Hold on. Yes, I will show you something.
Very
No,
mysterious,
I won't.
very
Okay,
exciting.
okay. Okay, so I'm going to tell you this. Sorry, I can't find the a mind map. Something I learned in 1972 is full of new age nonsense, radial thinking, dendrites, connections, etc., etc. A mind map, properly hierarchical, is the same as a tree diagram. The trouble with a tree diagram, graphically, not conceptually, is, mathematicians, excuse me as I use terrible language, the bottom of the triangle is fatter than the top. And we don't have paper that's wide. We don't have paper that size, which we need. So instead, if you were to imagine a tree diagram with 3 main component parts, if I just tear it and put 1 at the top, 2 at the side and 1 at the bottom, it's a tree diagram, but it's kind of radial, if you will. That doesn't sound too new agey. You know, it's not the type of thinking, it's a radial arrangement. There's no such thing as radial thinking, the radial arrangement. So the reason why mind maps are useful, and they don't have to be in color, they don't need to be wiggly lines, none of that hippie nonsense. You can do a mind map with stainless steel or rulers if you want to. It's the hierarchy that counts, goes all the way back to Aristotle, hierarchy, subsumption. And that, by the way, I'm going to finish off with image schemas. At Christmas, my 1-year-old grandson came from Singapore and he was playing with containers, those little cups. And he was doing super and subordinate consumption. Yes, he got a cup and he put a small cup inside a bigger cup and that inside a bigger cup. That experience of a cup within a cup within a cup is nested knowledge. And Aristotle's theories of categorization are built upon infants putting cups in within cups. It is no more complicated and no more mysterious. So how you arrange it graphically is one thing, and it's worth looking at what's most effective graphically, but conceptually, it's just the same old stuff. And it's been going on before Aristotle with folk taxonomies. Humans have always categorized, made sense.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, we have run out of time now, unfortunately. I want to thank you, Oliver, again very much. Everybody's thanking, I don't know if you can see the chats now, but everybody's thanking you a lot. I want to remind everybody that you can go on senecalearning.com and learn more about dual coding with Oliver Caviglioli, and then you can buy his book, which I totally recommend. Okay, and please sign up to our events next week. So next Wednesday, we're going to have, let me just make sure I don't say the wrong name here. We're going to have Sam Strickland talking about leadership in schools. So that's going to be very different from today, but also equally important. And also, Niels, we're going to have a geography conference on the 6th of June. So if we have any geography teachers in the room, sign up, same Eventbrite link. Okay, so thank you very much. Have a good day. Thank you, Oliver, very much for doing this. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.